So I'd like to begin by welcoming you here this evening. This really is a first for us and for our parish as we begin this year's series of Advent talks. Let's begin with a prayer taken from the opening prayer for the first Sunday of Advent. Grant your faithful, we pray, Almighty God, the resolve to run forth to meet your Christ with righteous deeds at his coming, so that gathered at his right hand we may be worthy to possess the heavenly kingdom. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God for ever and ever. Amen. Usually, these talks are given by an outside speaker. Last Advent, we welcomed back Brian Purfield. But this year, myself and Father Julian, probably in a moment of weakness, offered to speak. We did so long before COVID and lockdown had become a familiar part of our everyday life and vocabulary. I'll be giving the first 3 talks and Father Julian the final talk just before Christmas. For my part, I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak with you, because for much of the time when I do get to speak, it's within the context of the homily or notices at Mass, or a snatched conversation at the back of the church when time and other pressures are all at play. More importantly, I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak because of the disruption that has characterized so much of our parish life these past months. And not least because in a short while we will look to another parish assembly and the formation of our pastoral priorities for the next few years. Over the next 3 weeks, I want to consider the 3 virtues of faith, hope, and charity. But before your eyes glaze over, I want to reassure you that these are not intended to be academic lectures. I offer them because I want to reflect on the situation that we find ourselves in and to ask ourselves how we're to respond to this situation. And more especially, perhaps, what that reflection might mean for our future priorities. And I want to do all of this with Advent, with our journeying to the crib and the forthcoming celebration of Christmas firmly in view. I've paired these theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity with 3 W's: witness, walking, and worship. Witness to faith, walking in hope, worship, and charity. Why? Because faith is something that we are called to share. Hope is something that we're called to journey in. And charity, true charity, is only exercised where what we do and say begins and ends in communion with God. So let's begin. Witness in faith. Soon enough, all too soon probably, Christmas will be here. And the story of Christ's birth, which when all is said and done stands at the centre of Christmas, will be retold once more. Looking into the crib, we will recount how Mary and Joseph had gone in search of a place to stay, and how, finding no room, the Christ child came to be born in a stable, a dirty, dark stable. At best, Christ's birth took place in somewhat precarious circumstances. It all seems rather haphazard, doesn't it? poorly organised. And maybe, just maybe, the precariousness of it all, not least the stress of finding a place to stay, may have had done something to induce Christ's birth. What couple wouldn't be slightly frayed at the edges? 2,000 years on, with the crib captured in so many masterpieces, it's tempting to romanticize it all, to see it through rose-tinted spectacles. After all, St. Joseph was a saint, wasn't he? And Mary, we believe, the sinless, ever-virgin Mother of God. Seeing beyond these titles can be difficult. It's easy to forget that here we are faced with two people every inch as human as we are. Undoubtedly, Mary, our Blessed Mother, had the singular privilege of being the Mother of God. Yet for all this, Mary, like us, had things to discover. Just as you and I search after God, look for meaning and explanations, Mary, we're told, pondered everything. The answers did not fall readily into her lap. How else could she have been disturbed by the words of the angel announcing Christ's conception? How else could we explain her lack of understanding when she and Joseph discovered Christ teaching in the temple? How else could we account for the sword that pierced her soul as she held his lifeless body? With us, the Mary who journeyed to Bethlehem is a pilgrim. Hers is a journey of faith which, to her eternal credit and to our joy, she travelled willingly and generously, step by step. I don't imagine that Mary, even in the wildest of her most pious of imaginings, could have envisaged the visit of an angel or planned on being the Mother of God. She was a virgin engaged to be married. How, she must have asked herself, am I to explain this? What would Joseph say? Who would believe that an angel had visited her? They'd think she'd gone mad. And how would her parents cope with the disgrace? And yet, be that as it may, Mary had the faith to risk ridicule and rejection. Mary had the faith to say, yes, your will be done. And in that yes, in a single stroke, her world was turned upside down and inside out. All the preconceptions she must have harboured about the years ahead, all her plans, what she would do, how things would pan out, the security she derived from being engaged, all these were placed in jeopardy as she said her yes to God. Mary's yes to God at the Annunciation, much like the yes she continued to give him throughout the course of her earthly life, is all the more important, all the more impressive, because it was the yes of someone who had the real choice of saying no. There was nothing automatic or inevitable about Mary's yes. Yes, we believe that she remained free from sin, open to God's will, and was spared the stain of original sin. But remember, Eve, the first woman, was born without any mark of stain as well, without any mark or stain of sin. Yet where Eve chooses something other than God, refusing to heed his voice, Mary chooses to say yes, freely unconditionally, completely. For sure, God has a plan. He wants to send his Son into the world, and he wants Mary to be the mother of his Son. But God doesn't seek to dominate or control. His angel does not barter, bargain, hassle, or bribe. On the contrary, he requests, he asks, he invites, and having stated the case, awaits Mary's freely given response. In contrast to Mary, whose journey to the crib has its beginnings in an apparition, Joseph's journey to the manger is prefaced by a dream. It is here, through the emissary of yet another angel, that Joseph encounters the voice of God, a voice that tells him not to fear, just as it told Mary not to be afraid. Joseph, son of David, says the angel, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child in her is from the Holy Spirit. Having made the decision to put Mary aside quietly so as to spare her any disgrace, Joseph makes a decided U-turn. With Mary, like Mary, he hands over the control and shaping of his future to God. And in so doing, this righteous man trusts what he had learnt from the Lord in a dream and takes Mary home as his wife. The Joseph who journeys to the crib is the most silent of men. Nowhere in the course of the Scriptures do we hear his voice. Even the passing by of his presence, his death, goes unremarked. However, Joseph's silence is not the silence of a weak or anemic character. For underpinning that silence is the courage to trust where others may have been overcome with cynicism. A courage that allowed Joseph to put aside the kind of pride that may have been a barrier for weaker men. A courage which enabled him to cast aside the plans he must have had for their future and to live as a refugee, a foreigner, dispossessed, disempowered, without the support of family and friends in Egypt. For Joseph, as for Mary, the encounter with God draws on a faith which is prepared to risk everything and holds on to nothing, save the understanding that God is faithful. Here then, in the lives of Mary and Joseph, it is God's vision that holds sway. This year, so much of what we have known and taken for granted has been turned upside down and inside out. But this revolution is not God's doing. It has been the work of a virus, and more to the point, it has been absolute and unrelenting. It has touched everyone indiscriminately, developed and developing economies alike, and not least those who have died and been bereaved in its wake. Moreover, it has impinged on every aspect of our lives, at work, at home, with colleagues or among family and friends, and yes, all too evidently, here in church too, we're being forced to do things differently. Reflecting on this whole episode, I'm reminded of going into retreat. And yes, those early days of the lockdown were a kind of retreat. But retreats, and in particular the silence they call for, are not, I have to admit, things that I readily enjoy or find easy to enter into. Somewhere, if the retreat is to yield anything, you have to come to terms with the silence. You have to see the silence as a friend, not a threat. Something that brings with it a space and opportunity to grow, rather than a burden to be endured. Only then at peace with the silence, is it possible to live and breathe, to do something more than simply endure and get by? I'm as guilty as the next person. But so often, during these months of lockdown, the temptation is to look back, to hold on to the way things were and the way we would want them to be, rather than living in the present. The danger in all of this is that the past, the way things were, the world as we knew it, becomes something of a golden age, and dare I say it, a golden calf or idol to be worshipped or clung to. Perhaps one of the most frustrating features of where we are is the sense of helplessness. To date, we find ourselves very much at the mercy of the coronavirus. It's not us, and not us, are shaping the pattern of our lives. And that lack of control, where our lives and living is shaped by something or someone else, is a state of affairs we have a habit of kicking against. The story of how Adam and Eve sought control over their own lives is all too familiar. It's repeated in the account of the Tower at Babel, how in building the tower to the sky, the people of Babel sought to see as God sees, sought to be in control, only for God to pull the rug, quite literally, from beneath their feet. One of the most fundamental challenges of faith is to understand that our lives and work belong first and foremost to God. In his encyclical, or letter to the church called Lumen Fidei, or Light of Faith, Pope Francis likens the desire to shape things for ourselves to a voiceless idol. He writes, "In place of faith in God, it seems better to worship an idol into whose face we can look directly and whose origin we know, because it is the work of our own hands. Before an idol, there is no risk that we will be called to abandon our security. For idols, as it says in the Psalms, have mouths, but they cannot speak. Idols exist, we begin to see, as a pretext for setting ourselves at the center of reality and worshipping the work of our own hands." Pope Francis goes on to suggest that this desire to set our own goals rather than trusting in God's vision or promise for this life and for the next is a pointless exercise. Once man, he says, has lost the fundamental orientation which unifies his existence, he breaks down into the multiplicity of his desires. In refusing to await the time of promise, his life story disintegrates into a myriad of unconnected instants, an aimless passing from one Lord to another. Idolatry does not offer a journey, but rather a plethora of paths leading nowhere. Those who choose not to put their trust in God must hear the din of countless idols crying out, "Put your trust in me." Faith, concludes the Holy Father, is the opposite of idolatry. Faith breaks with idols to turn to the living God. I don't believe that God desires this current suffering for humanity, that the pandemic is a punishment visited on us by him. But I do share the belief that God can use us, sinners as we are, and situations, desperate as they may be, for the good. Might it be that this pandemic which we are living through, and the sense of helplessness, the lack of control it has engendered, could be a clarion call back to God, to a true understanding of who we are before and in relation to him. Of course, the temptation to hold on to things as they are or were and to shape things as we would want to shape them is not limited to now or to pandemics. There is an innate conservatism about most people, which is more comfortable with what exists and is known. But soon, as a parish, we will begin to look ahead to our own pastoral priorities for the coming years. In this sense, the disruption that the pandemic has brought with it, the shaking up it has involved, the reminder, as it were, that very little is sacred, small s, may be no bad thing. For if trusting in God's vision is a crucial aspect of faith, it goes hand in hand with a willingness, as we're reminded in Lumen Fide, to be constantly transformed and renewed by God's call. Just as Mary and Joseph's journey to the crib involved a letting go of older certainties, older ways of doing things, we too must be prepared to trust and to risk. More challengingly perhaps, we also need to keep in mind that the future which faith holds in view is that eternity with God for which we were created. Why did God make you? Asks the Penny Catechism. God made us to know him, love him and serve him in this world and to be with him in the next. It is this, rather than an untrammeled or pain-free existence in the here and now, that faith looks in, trusts in, and looks to. Mary and Joseph knew this reality. Their journeying to the crib, their yes to God, was just the beginning. They would suffer the pain of exile, and in Mary's case, the fulfillment of Simeon's prophecy in the temple, that a sword would pierce her own soul too. Faith, as Pope Francis puts it, is not a light to scatter all our darkness, but a lamp which guides our steps in the night and suffices for the journey. Oftentimes, when we speak of faith and faithful people, the image we have in our minds is of something solid, stable, immutable. It's a kind of fortress, and the mentality can be a kind of fortress mentality, with a definite or prevailing sense of there being an us and a them. As you know by now, listening to me, I have several nieces and nephews. And one of the joys of having nieces and nephews, certainly as they make their life choices, is the other people, the boyfriends and girlfriends that they bring into our lives. Children have a way of enlarging the circle. It begins, as you all know, with school and the school gate and the network of support and friendship that begins there. But it doesn't stop. And what is true for us is true also for Mary and Joseph. The Christ child, born in Bethlehem, enlarges their circle. The fact of his birth puts them into relationship to the shepherds and the kings who came to do him homage. And then, in time, it will bring others in their wake. Christ is born for the whole of humanity, and time and again, in the stable in Bethlehem, when they lose him in the temple about his father's business, and most surely as Mary sees him go to the cross, Joseph and Mary are reminded that this child of theirs is for others as much as he is for them. That he is not their personal possession to be held tightly, smothered, but that having him means making space for other people in their lives. In Lumen Fide, Pope Francis reminds us that faith is not a personal or individualistic affair. Faith, if it is anything, begins with a personal encounter with God, the God who is love. And love, knowing that we are loved, is something which enlarges and expands our lives. Indeed, if we are people of faith, if Christ lives in us, then we can do nothing more and nothing less than acknowledge all the children of God, Christ's brothers and sisters, as our brothers and sisters. For the person of faith, the secluded, selfish life, where my wants and desires, my needs are paramount, is a contradiction. Indeed, if we have truly encountered God, the God who is love, who shows us in his Son that loving knows everything about self-giving, then the selfish life is not an option for you or me. Of course, this way of life is demanding, but if we have had a personal encounter with Christ, if we have faith, then, as Lumen Fide reminds us, we will begin to see just as Christ sees. Simply put, if, like Mary and Joseph, we are to walk in faith, if we're to bring forth Christ to others, our outlook and thinking must take on a breadth. Faith isn't a call to narrow our horizons, to retreat into a fortress. On the contrary, faith is an invitation to broaden our horizons. It takes in believers and non-believers, just as Mary and Joseph welcome in the Gentile world with the visit of the Magi. As people of faith, we are to walk in and with the world, not to keep a distance from it. Clearly, then, faith, as the Holy Father puts it, is not intransigent, but grows in respectful coexistence with others. Far from making us inflexible, the security of faith sets us on a journey. It enables witness and dialogue with all. In these words of Pope Francis, we find an echo of the Second Vatican Council's writing on the Church in the modern world. For the person of faith, write the Fathers of the Council, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. So faith is never an invitation to smugness on our part, as if we have arrived, got everything that is needed, and can shut ourselves off. On the contrary, faith calls us, demands us to go out into the highways and the byways. Writing in 1975, Pope St. Paul VI reminded the Church that this reaching out to the world at large, this witness and evangelizing, is the grace and vocation proper to the Church, her deepest identity. She exists, he reminds us, to bring Christ into the world. In the form of the Magi, the world crowded into the stable at Bethlehem. But before this, the Word was enfleshed. It entered into the world, and Mary and Joseph showed him forth. On the eve of the current millennium, Pope St. John Paul II renewed this invitation to witness. In doing so, he reminded us that this is the work of each and every one of us, the responsibility of all the members of the people of God. He went on to insist that those who have come into genuine contact with Christ cannot keep Christ for themselves. They must proclaim him, concluding that a new apostolic outreach is needed, which will be lived as the everyday commitment of Christian communities and groups. Simply put, the Church does not have the option to rest assured of our having arrived, and neither do we as a parish community. Faith, as I've said over and over, risks. Faith is open. There's a world out there, a people who have not known Christ on our doorstep. You don't have to go abroad. and that people have a right to their fulfillment, their happiness, which in our Christian understanding can only come from knowing Christ. No one, as the fathers of the council reminded us, is freed from sin by himself and by his own power. No one is raised above himself. No one is completely rid of his sickness or his solitude or his servitude. On the contrary, all stand in need of Christ, their model, their mentor, their liberator, their saviour, their source of life. As we approach another parish assembly, one of the challenges we face is the challenge of walking in faith. Perhaps it is an invitation to let go of things, just as Mary and Joseph had to take the risk of trusting. But always and everywhere, faith remains that broadening of vision that makes room for and is open to others. Yes, we are a lively community, one where we are at home and, please God, feel nourished. But are we a welcoming community, willing to do things differently that others, those outside, might feel welcome to? Always and everywhere, the risk is to look inwards, to get this bit of the kingdom sorted as we would have it sorted in our own image. It's good here, we say to ourselves, because I can live out my faith comfortably with people like me. But that isn't the point. Christ came, was born in Bethlehem for all nations, for all people, that all may be drawn into his family. Hopefully, a parish, a church, a community like ours is a place of respite, somewhere where we can be healed and made whole. But it can never be a retreat, a place away from the world. For always and everywhere, the people of God are called to be a leaven in the world, just as the Son entered into the world, working within to dispose it, to dispose the world always and everywhere in accordance with Christ. So, there we have it, the first Advent talk, Faith and Witness. Now, there's an opportunity for some questions, but as you can imagine, asking questions and answering them in these conditions is a bit different. You can't just sit in your sitting rooms and put up your hand. So, what you're invited to do is to type those questions in using the web chat, which has been facilitated. And then Peter, who's somewhere out there, and I are going to have a Zoom conversation, and Peter will relay your questions to me, and I'll answer them over the stream. So I'll give you a few moments, a few minutes maybe, to think of a question that you'd like to ask, if indeed you'd like to ask any, and then Peter will feed them back through to me here. Hi, Peter. So we're just we're giving everyone a few moments, and if there are any questions, you can relay them.
I can't hear you.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Can't hear you at all. But if you can hear me,
Oh, wait there.
it's on this.
Can you hear me now, Peter?
Yeah.
Yep. Good. Thank you.
So, what have we got? Oh, they give us questions.
Oh, good.
They're saying thank you.
Thank you.
Faith, that we are indeed listening. Don't understand that question.
Okay.
Melanie says, how do we become more like Jesus? Faith in God and not anxious and apprehensive about the future.
Okay. So one of the questions there is, how do we become more and more like Mary and Joseph, trusting and so on, and not being anxious about the future? Well, I think St. Therese has a good piece of advice for us, which is to do little things. And by that I mean this: how do we trust and grow in confidence? We do that in little steps. And I think probably that's what Mary and Joseph did. So even when, for example, Mary was asked to be the mother of the Lord, when the angel appeared to her, she couldn't have had in her mind where that eventually would take her. She took it one step at a time. Same with Joseph, one step at a time. And I think, like most things in our lives, if we want to get through something that's challenging, we have to break it down into its component parts. And dealing with each of those little challenges, is the way to success. Rome wasn't built in a day, you'll remember. And I think for us, it must be that we do things bit by bit, because success breeds success, if you like. In a different context, in his encyclical Sacramentum Caritatis, Sacrament of Love, Pope Benedict sets before us the challenge of loving our brothers and sisters. How are we going to be a people of love? And because that's a really difficult thing. How do I love somebody I don't like? How do I love everyone indiscriminately? Surely that's impossible. And Pope Benedict, when he faces that question, says to us very loudly and clearly and very simply, just do it. Just do it, because the more we do it in small ways, the more it becomes a habit and a part of our lives. Mary and Joseph, trusted. And I'm sure every day they had to renew that trust. So in my own life, for example, if I think about my priesthood, I think about what took me into the seminary, I think about what took me through the seminary to ordination, and I think about what keeps me here as a priest. And what keeps me as a priest and what took me through the seminary wasn't the same thing that enabled me to hear the call of God when I was a young boy of about 12. And it's the same for each and every one of you. Certainly if you're married, you get married, you trust, you hope. But again and again through the course of married life, you have to renew that trust and that commitment as you face new situations and new circumstances. When you first have children, You have to work out your relationship. And then when the children leave home, you have to work out the relationship again. And then when you're both sat there by the fire and retired, you have to renew your trust and your commitment again. So walking the way of trust for us, I imagine, is much the same as it was for Mary and Joseph. They weren't super special people. They were ordinary human beings like you and me. And the way we build up trust and the way we journey through life is bit by bit, stage by stage. Hope that's okay. So, Peter, have we got another question?
We have. We've got some really good questions. Yeah.
Okay.
We've got, we don't all get visits with angels or have prophetic dreams. So how are we to recognise God's voice for each of us?
So we don't all have angels visiting us, and we don't all have dreams where God speaks to us. So how are we supposed to know? How are we supposed to hear the voice of God? Well, I think last Sunday's gospel was a fantastic answer to that question. The Lord says, "Whatsoever you do to the least of these brothers of mine, that you do unto me." When we see another person, when a person in the street addresses us, the invitation from the Lord is to remember that He is that man or woman. That the brother or sister we encounter in the street is Christ. And Christ speaks through them. Don't forget, we're told that each and every one of us are created in the image of God. And that God's Spirit dwells within each and every one of us. It was God's Spirit that brought us to life. So, maybe we'd all love to have angels and apparitions and dreams. I would love to have angels, apparitions and dreams so that they could tell me concretely and directly. But that's not to say that we are without the voice of God in our lives. I suppose what the challenge for you and for me is to be attuned to that voice and to hear that voice. I can pass the person in the street and say, that's X, Y, or Z. That's Mr. So-and-so, that's Mrs. So-and-so, whatever. But if I'm really attuned, will I pass them and say, there is the image of God. There is the presence of Christ. That's the challenge, it seems to me. Okay. Peter, another question.
Yep, we have. Who are today's magi?
Who are today's magi? Well, so I think in the nativity, in that story, the magi are the representatives of the Gentile world. So today's magi, to my mind, are all the people out there, the people of other faiths and no faith. And you and I, just as Joseph and Mary did in that manger, are called to enter into a relationship with them. And above all, you and I have got to recognize that the Lord doesn't just come for you and for me in buildings and churches like this, but He comes for everyone. People of faith and people of no faith. People who are journeying and still pilgrimaging. So who are today's magi? It's every person you see outside. It's very simple. Because that's who the Lord comes for. And our temptation, I suppose, at times is to live our parish life and live our own faith lives in a kind of ghetto where we forget about the world outside and we forget about our obligation to that world. That challenge to bring the Lord to bring Christ to the world at large. Okay. Another question, Peter.
How do we become a more welcoming church when we're such a large community and newcomers get lost in the crowd?
So how do we become a more welcoming church when we're so large and the newcomer can get lost in the crowd? Well, I think the first thing is we've got to try and recognize the newcomer. But the first thing we've got to do is actually, get to know ourselves. Oftentimes in parish life, it's the same in this parish, it's the same in every parish. You come to a funeral or somebody has died and, they might see the booklet with that person's picture on it and they'll say, oh, I recognize that person, but we never actually spoke. They used to sit 3 or 4 rows down in front of me every Sunday, week in and week out, but we never actually spoke. And that says an awful lot, doesn't it? So if we're going to become a more welcoming community to the stranger, we've got to learn how to be with each other in the first place. And if we're going to be a welcoming community, and we'll move on to this in the next couple of talks, but if we're going to be a welcoming community, we've got to make room for people. I need to be careful when I say this because I don't mean to use anyone as a particular example, but let's say in parishes everyone's got jobs that they do, and a new person comes in with a particular set of gifts and talents. And the challenge for us who are here already, if you like, is to make the space for that person to contribute what they can contribute. So for example, if I'm the person who always does this job, and that's the job that a newcomer could easily and readily do, then maybe we as a community need to say to ourselves, okay, maybe we need to change things so that that person can develop a sense of belonging. So there's that sense of welcome and that sense of space. It's a recognition from beginning to end that when any new person comes through the door, this community is changed. And the presence of that new person among us and with us requires you and me to do things differently. It's a challenge, but that's the only way that we're going to get people to feel welcome. And ordinary everyday things, saying hello, giving a smile. As we leave the church, for example, one of the things about our parish community at the moment is when it comes to the end of Mass, people go out the front door and immediately, we're into the cars that are parked at the front and we're onto the steps, and there's not a lot of gathering outside. We have tea and coffee sometimes in the parish centre next door, but very few people come. If we're going to be a welcoming community, we have to make time for each other as well. So make room for other people and make time for each other. It's not just a kind of come here, get Mass, go away, but come here, celebrate Mass, celebrate communion with the Lord, and then be that communion when we go outside the door. Peter, have we got another question? Say it again, Peter.
Have you got any tips for families with young children when it comes to spending Advent and helping out in the local community?
Have I got any tips for families with young children when it comes to Advent and helping out in the local community? Well, that's a hard question. There's a lot in that question. I think, obviously, we've got all the sorts of rules and regulations that we've got to adhere to at the moment. But I think, the honest answer to that question is our children learn by looking at us, by looking at the adults around them. If we want our children to develop a particular predisposition or to develop a vocabulary, if you like, then we have to use that vocabulary and be that predisposition in our own lives. So what's going to take my children to prayer is my praying, your praying. You're praying at home as well as you're praying here. What's going to help my children develop a predisposition towards their love of neighbour is your love of neighbour, my love of neighbour, the ordinary, everyday ways in everyday life that we're able to be neighbourly to others. And I think probably that's the most realistic answer I could give, because we can't be getting our children to do one thing and saying another thing with our own words and actions. So if we're talking about Advent and this coming Advent, and Advent is a time to turn back to the Lord, then in our families it begins with us, with mum and dad, with us adults, turning back to the Lord in word and in action. And in the local community, it does mean, certainly at the moment, it does mean giving, taking notice of the people around us. You don't have to join a club to be a good neighbour. You have to deal with the neighbour next door to you, and or on the same street. And they don't have to be people like us. They don't have to be people we know particularly well and as such, but to encourage the children to see every other person and the people closest to them, and by that I mean physically, their actual neighbours, as people that God sets before them with a dignity that needs to be trusted and respected, and as people who have to be loved. Because that's what Christmas is, isn't it? Christmas comes about because God so loved the world that he sent his only Son into the world. And God gives us our neighbours next door, right next door, to be loved, no matter how difficult that might be. So begin with the people next door. Little things, little ways. It becomes a habit, it becomes a way of life, it becomes a predisposition. And that's what I would say. Peter.
If we put our faith totally in Christ, allowing us to relax and feel no need for any planning for our futures, can this present its own problems?
Yes, I think. I mean, the whole challenge is to trust in the Lord, But that trust in the Lord, there's that saying, isn't it? Grace builds upon nature. You go back to the story of the Annunciation, and Mary cooperates with God. So God has a will, if you like, a desire, a plan, but that's not something that he foists on Mary. And God's plan for our lives is not something he's going to foist onto us. God creates us, gives us life, but leaves us free. So following the will of God isn't simply a question of saying, well, I don't have to do anything. We do have to do something. We have to say that yes, and then we have to get up and live out that yes. Mary had to live out that yes, I suppose on one level, quite practically by bearing a child. Joseph had to live out that yes by making that journey, as it were, to Bethlehem. Joseph had to live out that yes by taking his family into Egypt, into exile. So I don't think the invitation to trust in the Lord means that we have nothing to do and that it's a kind of spiritual kind of abandonment into God's call, because God calls us, but he also calls for our cooperation, because it's not in the nature of God to force his will on his creation. He's a loving parent, and if you're a parent, you certainly have ideas about what you want your children to do. You may even have all plans in the world for what you'd like them to do. But at some level, you realize and understand that they have to take that up and own it for themselves. And it's only when it's owned for themselves that it comes alive. So that's what I would say when we think about trusting in God's will. It's not a kind of laissez-faire, I don't have to do anything now. It's actually quite demanding. Any more questions, Peter?
Just one, but it's bigger.
Go on then.
How are we to understand the omnipotence of God such that all things happen through his will? Therefore, the current pandemic must be through his will.
Well, I think you have to, when we talk about God's will and history, the events in the world, I think it's one thing to say that God knows everything. It's another thing to say that God wills everything. What do I mean by that? I think the best way to think of it is this: when we say that God is omnipotent, God is all-knowing, then God is a bit like, if you imagine God standing here, and then that's the beginning of time, and that's the end of time. And because God is standing here, God can see everything from beginning to end. That's his vantage point. So he can see the beginning, he can see what happens next, and he can see it all the way through, because he stands outside of time, outside of the beginning and the end. He is eternal, yeah? So God can see everything. He can see the whole drama working its way through. But that doesn't mean to say that in seeing everything, he wills everything. And I think that's the way I would understand like the pandemic and the course of every evil, that we experience, war and all those sorts of things. They happen. They're in God's sight, as it were, but that's not to say that God is the engineer of all of those things. And what I do believe, however, is that God can use those things to bring good about. The current pandemic is a terrible thing, but there are good things about it. And by that I mean, look at all the good that it's brought about, the neighbourliness that it's brought about, the generosity that it's brought about. One of the things I was thinking about the other day, I was walking around the park and I met another parishioner, and often I try and walk around the park, not every day, but often. And often when I'm in the park walking around, I meet a parishioner and we have a chat, and I think, that was a blessing that this current situation has brought into my life. That time to walk around, because I'm shut in so much at the moment, I make a conscientious effort to get out there. But seeing people, speaking with people in the park and so on the street in a more leisurely way at the moment is a great thing. When we had that lockdown at the beginning and we were all clapping for the NHS, standing on the street, and getting to know the people who live next door to me, who live further along the street, that was a blessing, So there are blessings about the current pandemic, as well as, the obvious suffering that's going on as well. But I don't think God's knowing everything can be equated with God's intending everything, because that would say that there is no such thing as free will. And free will, our ability to choose good from bad, right from wrong, is really at the heart of what it is for us to be a dignified people. You know, we're not kind of like puppets on a string with God pulling all the strings, because that would be completely dehumanizing as we would understand it. Our humanity, our dignity rests in our being free to choose. God doesn't make us love him. God desires that we love him, but he's not going to force us to. I hope that's an answer. It's a complicated question. But I think, is that all the questions, Peter?
That's all, but everybody said thank you so much
Okay.
for excellent talk.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you for all your answers.
So, thank you for joining me this evening. It's a bit of an odd experience, but I kind of enjoyed it, and I hope you have enjoyed it too. And next week, same time, same place, we'll be talking about walking in hope. So, God bless you, God keep you. Good night.